My garden has got a lot of weeds, but for a good reason. I saved them for you. It's this weed here in particular that I saved as a sermon illustration. Here it is when it's young, and this is what it looks like when it's matured a bit. It's one of the most widespread weeds in the world, growing in almost any soil condition. And if you have a garden, you've probably pulled a lot of these out of the soil. But did you know that it is entirely edible and very good for you? It is said to outclass spinach as a storehouse for protein, calcium, phosphate, iron, vitamin C, and A. When it's young, you can just pick and eat the whole thing. The stem, though, will become a bit woody, so when it matures, just eat the leaves from it. You can eat it raw, but it's best if you saute it or cook it in something. It's related to the same family as quinoa, so if you know what to do, you could even eat the seeds from it. This plant has been eaten since prehistoric times in both North America and Europe. The scientific name for it is Chenopodium album. You might know it as goosefoot, maybe as pigweed, or my favorite term, lamb's quarters. No one knows for sure why it's called lamb's quarters, but the most likely origin is that it comes from Lammas quarter. Lammas was one of the seasons, the quarters, of the church year. It went Candlemas, Whitsunday, Lammas, and Martinmas. The word Lammas comes from the Anglo-Saxon for loaf mass. Loaf as in like a loaf of bread, and mass like a church service. Lammas was celebrated on August 1st to correspond with the first harvest of the summer. People would take the grains from that first harvest, they'd mill it into flour, and then bake it into a loaf that would be blessed at church, maybe even used as communion. This celebration of the first fruits has biblical roots. There'd be a special offering to God from the first fruits, and in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul calls Christ, quote, the first fruit, saying, "But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who had fallen asleep." But back to the plant. Whether I want it or not, this little plant, this lamb's quarters, is certainly one of the first fruits in my garden. I can imagine like earlier generations eating a lot of this during that Lammas quarter of the year. You might be wondering, if it's so nutritious, why aren't we eating more of it now? Well, the problem with it is that it is difficult to harvest. As soon as it's plucked, it starts to wilt. And the seeds take a lot of work to be collecting and processing. So in the commercialized agriculture of today, it just isn't worth the effort. You have to pick it yourself right when you want to eat it. Which reminds me of a different type of loaf, manna. God provided manna, which was said to be like a loaf of bread, for the Israelites as they wandered through the desert, but it had to be eaten that day. It wouldn't keep. It was a reminder to be relying on the blessings of God as they journeyed. In the same way, this ubiquitous weed is probably the healthiest thing on my yard and scattered all around like manna, placed there through no effort on our part. Here we are, walking around creation, surrounded by more blessings from God than we realize. So many blessings, in fact, that we're probably tossing them out as weeds. I wonder what else we might be overlooking in our lives. I'm telling you about lamb's quarters because I like the name, really. It's this reminder to me of Christ everywhere in my yard. Whether you choose to eat these lamb's quarters or not, at the very least, I hope the next time that you're plucking it out of the ground, I hope it reminds you of God's bounty. There is a harvest of the Creator's love all around us. Amen.